on these kinds of policies, needs to begin to focus on these explicit policies that segregated the country and attempt to undo them.
So for those who say, pull up your bootstraps, it sounds to me a little like they're talking to people who were never allowed into the boot shop in the first place.
Well, that's correct. That wealth gap that I described a few minutes ago between the African American household wealth and white household wealth, roughly 5% ratio, determines much of the inequality we have today. It determines the achievement gap in schools when we concentrate the most disadvantaged children in schools with poor resources. It determines health disparities between African Americans and whites. So many African Americans live in more polluted neighborhoods. They have greater rates of heart disease, more higher rates of diabetes from lack of access to fresh food. And it even determines, to a certain extent, the police abuse of African Americans, which could not exist to the extent it does. I'm not suggesting that segregation is the only cause of it, but it couldn't exist to the extent that it does if we weren't concentrating the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods without access to jobs and transportation to get the good jobs, and where they get engaged in these kinds of confrontations with police. If that community was not concentrated in communities without resources and was more integrated throughout the general population, white working class, white poor families aren't segregated in single white low-income neighborhoods. This is a uniquely racial caste system, and it creates the conditions for police acting like a colonial force to keep a lower class population down, much as police forces in India or the Congo or in third world countries were deployed in order to keep down lower class populations.
And Vinny, one other fascinating sort of legal aspect of this sort of segregation that was mandated by government. Mandated by government. It's hard to even say those words out loud, that our federal government insisted that you can't get any guarantees, you can't get any loan guarantees or permitting unless you segregate, is the zoning. And that was done at a different level, usually at the state and local level. And back in the 50s and the 40s, a lot of the zoning rules allowed for industrial plants, waste disposal plants, toxic industry to be built in African American communities, but not in white communities, and thereby creating what were likely slum conditions, or at least seemed to be slum conditions, which then propagated the thought that, well, those living in those slum areas shouldn't be mixing with the non-slum areas. So it was just sort of this terrible cycle that you would think after 70 years would fix itself, but as you just heard, there's all that equity that was built over a generation or two that African Americans didn't have access to.
Yeah, and you look at the issue. I mean, the laws obviously have changed immensely for developers today, as well as real estate agents and anyone else that's buying and selling. But if you trace back the history, maybe that ends up being a part of the cause of where we are now.
I'm sitting in a house that was built in 1919, and I'm actually now spurred to action to go to town hall, pull my deed, and see if that language is in there. I don't think it is, because this is just, this is more circa World War I, and most of that happened after World War II. But still, when he said, "Look at your deed today. You are not allowed to take the language out of your deed. You can't enforce that awful language that says nobody but a Caucasian can buy or rent or, be in this house. You can't enforce it, but you can't extract it," which I thought was just sort of chilling.
Yeah, chilling and strange, but a history lesson. Thanks so much, Ashley. Appreciate it.
Sure thing.
All right, when we come back, there was some court action today.